Paula, thank you for inviting me to share the Seder meal with you.
Gladly.
Now, I have to tell you, I don't know too much about a Seder meal, so I'm going to ask you some questions, if that's okay.
Certainly.
Well, first of all, what is a Seder meal, and why did you celebrate it?
Well, the Seder, actually the word Seder means order. And this is a meal that is eaten in a particular order. It's not as if you just sit down and you fill your plate and you just start eating. There's an order to questions that are asked. There's an order to rituals that are done. The reason the Seder is held is because of the Passover, when God sent the angel of death to pass over the houses of Jews and to kill the Egyptians' firstborn sons. The reason they continue to do it these thousands of years later is because they are commanded in the book of Exodus to celebrate the Seder.
So why did Jesus celebrate it?
Well, Jesus celebrated it because he was a Jew. He was a practicing Jew. So he would have known about the service. He would have participated in his service every year of his life with his family.
From being very young.
From being very young, yes.
So do the foods have a particular meaning?
The foods do have a very particular meaning, and I'll explain them to you. One thing that should be on this plate and is not is the shank bone of a lamb, which represents the fact that God commanded Moses to tell the Jews to take a lamb bone and take the blood of the lamb and paint it over the thresholds of their door. I didn't get a lamb shank because neither you nor I eat lamb, so that didn't make a lot of sense. There is something right here that is made of apples and walnuts and cinnamon and wine. And it represents the mortar that the Jews built the bricks with as they built buildings for the Egyptians when the Jews were slaves. There is horseradish, which represents the bitterness of their lives as slaves. There is salt water, which represents the tears that they cried as slaves, as mourning lost ones, mourning the death of infants. There is parsley to represent springtime, and that even in our darkest times, there is always new chances and new birth. And the egg is symbolic in several Jewish rituals because it's round for beginners, and so nothing bad can stay on top of it. If you were to put something on top of the egg, it would slide off. And so if this egg represented our lives, even though we go through dark times and difficult times,
Yes, we do.
it doesn't stay with us. Yeah, how appropriate for right now.
How appropriate, yes.
So, and then the last thing is a piece of unleavened bread. The Jews call the bread matzah. We're using a piece of our communion bread. The reason it is flat is because the Jews didn't even have time to prepare leavened bread
For it to rise.
And if you were to eat matzah, what is currently eaten for the unleavened bread, you would see that it is covered in holes. And so the holes are in there specifically so that the bread cannot rise at all. So it's very representative of the Jews' time in slavery and of the time immediately before their exodus from slavery into freedom.
Wow.
So what Jesus would have done is that, to begin with, he would have blessed the light of candles, which we don't have.
We tried.
We tried, yes.
But they were way too big.
They were too big. They were taller than us. Secondly, he would have blessed the wine. He would have said, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri hagafen. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who has created the fruit of the vine.
Oh.
He would have blessed the bread as well. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'hamid ner shel Pesach, or Passover. So those are two things that Jesus obviously would have done, because he would have been the host, the table master, if you would, master of ceremonies at this service. There are, at Passover meal, the adults drink 4 glasses of wine.
Oh my.
It is.
Good time.
It is.
Enjoy Passover.
And they do it for a very specific reason. The reasons are 4 promises that God has made to people. That he will free us, he will protect us, he will redeem us, he will remember us always as his children. And so for every one of those points in the service where were this a real Seder, that they would discuss that or remember that, they would drink a cup of wine. Children obviously don't drink the wine until they turn 13 years of age.
Oh.
So I will tell you that on my first Passover, I fell asleep in my parents' car on the way home. So even though age-wise I was ready for 4 cups of wine, I really wasn't.
It wasn't right, yeah. There's a reason, right? 13-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you about this. I noticed there's this empty chair here, and there's a goblet for the chalice for
someone.
For someone who doesn't seem to be here right now.
The Jews believe, based on the writings of those prophets known as Elijah, that Elijah will bring the Messiah. And the Jews still wait for the arrival of the Messiah. And so at the Passover meal, the empty chair is for Elijah. The goblet of wine is for Elijah.
Well.
And if this were a real house, at a later part in the service, in the order of the meal, the youngest child would get up and open the door so that Elijah could enter.
Wow.
So you can imagine what every child must think about. Am I going to be the one that opens the door and
Elijah's standing there, right? That would be quite a thrill.
It would.
Well, let me ask you, then, what is the connection between this and what we as Christians think of as the Last Supper?
Tradition has it that Jesus' Last Supper was the Passover meal, was in fact the Seder. Obviously there's scholars that say no, it wasn't, but tradition has it that it was. And the date of Passover moves just as the date of Easter moves, but they are always close to one another. So in our calendar there's 12 months, in the Hebrew calendar there's 13 months.
Well, if I'm correct, I think actually today, this evening, is
this evening is
Passover on
the
our,
first night of
on
Passover.
our calendar right here, right
Yes.
now. Yes.
And so for Jews throughout the world, they will eat unleavened bread for the next 8 days, because Passover is celebrated for 8 days, even though the Seder is only on the first and possibly the second night for some Jews.
Leftovers?
They could have leftovers, yes, but as always, they will eat unleavened bread during that time. They will eat only things that are kosher for Passover. So there is a dairy in Cincinnati, Ohio, that 2 weeks before the Passover, they close the dairy. They strip it of all the equipment. They clean it.
Wow.
They go to a storage facility they have. They bring in the machinery only for Passover. At the end of Passover, they close for another 2 weeks. They clean all of that machinery, they put it back in storage, and they bring back
Getting
in.
back to regular.
Right?
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's a big commitment, is it
Yeah,
not?
very. Evan, one more question. Is there any connection at all between the Seder meal and Jesus washing feet?
There are so many connections in my mind. Were this a real Seder meal, you and I would, at one part in the meal, we would wash our hands. We would very ritualistically wash our hands to cleanse us of the grime of the world. During the time of Jesus, the only people that washed feet, and you can imagine what your feet must have been like at the end of the day.
Yes.
If you're wearing sandals
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
walk in the same place the cows walked,
And the dust.
the dust and the
yeah.
pebbles. So Jews that did not have a great deal of wealth, which was most of the Jews, washed their own feet. If you were a Sadducee or a Pharisee or a Jew of importance, which was mostly Sadducees and Pharisees, you would have a slave wash your feet. So for Jesus to take off his robes and wash the feet of his disciples, he was making a statement that I'm your servant. I mean, I'm your king, but I'm your servant.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Kind of the paradox of Christianity.
Yes.
Yes. Right there.
But the fact that Jesus is the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, and at the Passover we have the lamb shank,
Mm-hmm.
and at Passover or at the Last Supper we had Jesus washing the literal dirt of the world off the feet of his disciples. Is just very powerful to me.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Yeah.
And the fact that the Passover celebrates the exodus of the Jews from Egypt
Mm-hmm.
and freedom from slavery. And then we have the image of Moses leading them out. And we have the image of Moses and Elijah with Jesus at his transfiguration.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Right.
on Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, we have Jesus ushering in our freedom from death.
Yes. Mm.
So it's very difficult. I still cannot separate out Passover is the Last Supper
Uh-huh.
and the acts that Jesus would go on to do over the next several days.
Well, I thank you so much, because I certainly know more about the Seder than I did when we sat down here.
I will tell you that what you would do in the real meal, since I've told you everything and haven't let you eat anything,
Oh.
is that you would take your parsley
Mm-hmm.
and dip it in the salt water and have a couple of nibbles. And obviously be reminded of tears.
Might make a few.
One of the other things you would do is take some of this, which is called haroset, and you would put it on a piece of matzah, and you would take a small amount of the horseradish. The haroset's a little sweet, but not very sweet. And you would make an open sandwich. And then you would eat your egg. Again, you would either eat it, dip it in the salt water, or not. And I'm sorry, but we have a lot of work to do tonight, and so we can't have cups of
all of
wine.
it. Well. Mm.
And at the end of a Passover dinner, everybody holds up their cup of wine and says, "Next year in Jerusalem."
Oh. Well, I got some hot.
Keila, thank you for sharing it with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it very much.